Well, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon plenary of this full day of programming here at the Kuyper Conference. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our other sponsors outside of the Calvin institutional orbit for their support, and our exhibitors. Stock Publishers is out there. They've got a number of books on display. Baker Academic, Lexham Press, as I mentioned last night, the publisher of the Abraham Kuyper translation series. The Acton Institute has a table out there with a special issue of the Journal of Markets and Morality on Abraham Kuyper. And the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, which is the institution with which I am affiliated as a full-time employee, a member of the research department as director there. The CRCD is also the sponsor of this lecture, of this plenary session. And the speaker is a pastor. He has a PhD from Poland, and his name is Mateusz Wichary. He's a Polish Baptist theologian and leader. He has served as president of the Polish Baptist Union for 2 terms previously, chairman of the Polish Evangelical Alliance for 2 terms, and is vice rector of the High Baptist Theological Seminary in Warsaw, Poland. He's editor-in-chief of the monthly Word of Truth magazine and vice president of the European Baptist Federation. He's married, he has 2 children, and is currently involved in establishing a theological college in Tanzania. And he and his church are involved in doing pastoral work with Ukrainians fleeing the conflict and the war and the aggression in Ukraine. So please join me in welcoming Mateusz Wichary to speak to us today.
Thank you very much. It's a joy for me to be with you here. During my preparation for doctorate, I often read some articles written by the professors of this school, so it is really joy for me after those 10 years to be actually be able present here in my own body with you. How Abraham Kuyper became Apostle Paul to me, reflections on how Abraham Kuyper is a model for a Christian leader and thinker. How to incarnate the word incarnate into our reality. In his first Stone Lectures, Kuyper argued that if our Christian grasp of reality is anything less than all-embracing life system, it is a powerless, accidental event in the history of mankind. In short, Christianity, or a true Christian tradition like Reformed camp, is to create its own way of life. From its religious deepest life principle, it is to develop its own peculiar form of existence. And without such an achievement, any claim of a given movement to be God's significant work in history is a pitiful elevation of ambition over reality. And most of us here, knowing Kuyper, knows this. But let me suggest another angle. If the incarnation of the word incarnate is so, it is to happen in history in a certain way. We are not talking here about an impersonal process of hidden operation of the Spirit in the soul alone. It is personal and at least in part observable. And actually yesterday, plenary was about it, right? About the journey, about this whole process. And I'm actually referring to the same reality, although in a different way. We are talking here about the influence of consciousness on consciousness, faith on faith, organic transition, influence of man on man. We are speaking here about phenomenon described in biblical language as discipleship. Jesus appointed his disciples first of all so that they might be with him. Mark 3:14. From the perspective of systematic theology, we can and should look at the Son's incarnation as once and for all redemption event. But we see it also as a model for us to follow, calling to following Christ, to take up our cross and deny ourselves without reference to the life of Christ himself are but incomprehensible and exotic metaphors. If personal transformation is so, it calls us to be Christ's role models in Christianity. And again, If it is so, we should see the principle operating already in the Bible between first followers of Christ. And we do. This principle is seen clearly in the ministry of Apostle Paul, persuading the recipients of his letters both to follow him and to be the model to follow for others. In Philippians 3:17, we find such his exhortation. Brothers, join in imitating me, and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. Timothy is to set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. And Titus is to show himself in all respects to be a model of good works. The summary of this process, which is now gaining a similar importance as the great missionary calling of Matthew 28, especially in the disciple-making movement, is to be found in 2 Timothy 2:2. What you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, and trust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Here we find the chain of discipleship, holy relay race through spiritual generations, where organic life of Christianity with its truth is transferred through regenerated lives, one from the another. I have also the impression that we, and I speak as we here, the evangelical tradition broadly taken, are hypocritically hiding behind the uniqueness of Christ by so willingly confessing our own sinfulness in this particular context, instead of honestly asking ourselves how we can and should set ourselves as a model for others. And not because we are perfect, but rather because this is what Christianity is all about, taking responsibility for the mission and advancement of God's kingdom, in shaping the people around us through our own changed lives. Refusing to accept this obligation, I don't think is humility, rather it is an admission of failure. In a way, it's a declaration of no real change in life that can afford others. And each of these options proves a lack of regeneration, or at least very shallow regeneration, and a fake Christianity. Finally, although there is an emphasis on personal dimension of God's way of changing life in the disciple-making movement, I think it lacks the attitude of dependency, submission, and the master-apprentice relationship. This seems to me to be crucial to this biblical model of incarnation, perhaps even more important than this personal aspect of transformation. The willingness to imitate seems to me more important than the relationship as such, personal, physical. This is also a necessary premise for the recognition of books, and primarily scripture, as God's means of influence on one's life. The willingness to submit to the author must be assumed as the factor that shapes life of those who are willingly submitting to the content and want to follow the example. So these thoughts leads me to my reflection on Abraham Kuyper's influence on my life. I see it in two ways. First, as an impact on my thinking. Questions and struggles important to him turned out to be very practically important to me as well. I will talk more about it in a moment, and it will take up most of my lecture. Second, and it's a more mysterious and indeed a metaphysical observation, as an impact on my life story. Despite many differences, I see an analogy between his life and mine. Certain stages and experiences we walked through, if or just separately, but with some similarities. I may be exaggerating and over-interpreting God's providence here, but I see commonalities between us. The way God shaped him and how God is shaping me. I will try to briefly present the evidence to give you the basis to think about whether this is actually the case. Anyway, apart from telling you about my struggles and encouragements with Kuiperian concepts, To help you see how I came to this conclusion, that God can use someone's life as a pattern in his way with other Christians, is the most important goal for me in this whole presentation. And it is so because it seems to me a very interesting discovery and concept, an encouraging one, that both through our views, but also through our history of life, God is willing to shape and change successive generations of Christian leaders and thinkers. If it is so, I think it is, it opens for us an important dimension of the meaning of our life, and it motivates self-sacrifice and piety in a new way. At least for me, I hope maybe I will encourage you to think in the same way. Before turning to my own struggling with Abraham Kuyper's thought, let me outline the most necessary context, although it was mentioned. In 2012, I defended my doctoral dissertation at Chrześcijańska Akademia Teologiczna in Warsaw, Poland, on the basic concepts of political theology in the thought of Abraham Kuyper. This is the first monograph in history devoted to Kuiper as well as his political theology in Polish language, which, by the way, was also published 2 years later. Preparing for this dissertation was time in my life of in-depth reflection on the sovereignty of God, the necessity of Christian worldview, the reality of antithesis and common grace, as well as the sovereignty of the spheres. All these concepts have proved to be important in my continued ministry, most notably as the president of my denomination and chairman of Polish Evangelical Alliance. And these concepts proved to be practical and challenging ones on various stages of my leadership practice. I will refer to few such moments in this lecture. So firstly, God's sovereignty as an inevitable starting point. There are some quotes that for some reason stay with me. For example, a quote of Mackenzie Langley, who defined the political spirituality of Kuyper's anti-revolutionary party as the ability to see both sin and grace in public affairs. This definition shows the essential feature of the mature Christian mind. It is seeing all reality, including the politics, in the perspective of grace. Spiritual regeneration causes man to see God as a person involved in the reality. Naturally, one connects him with those spheres and events where man sees God's action most intensely, with prayer, with reading God's word, with fellowship, with the church. Sometimes one also perceives them in special moments of community life. And right now, I think Polish response to Ukrainian refugees, at least from my experience, is such moment. It's extraordinary. Whatever the purpose behind it, I think it's unique. Not many, though, see God in politics as well. But this definition also mentions another principle in a Christian life that can lead to unbelief or cynicism. It is gradual, ever clearer perception of evil, sin, selfishness, low motives, weakness, fragility, hypocrisy, even in these previously sacred moments and events. It turns out that with not much effort, it is possible to interpret the vast majority of Christian events in a purely human way, in which transcendence or mystery, if we still see it, and we assume it exists, does not necessarily prove any specifically Christian version of it. I would like to emphasize that at the same time, when one grows with the realization of the presence of sin, one can also become more deeply aware of God's work, so that a truer perception of sin does not lead to a crisis of faith. And I think this is the process I am in. As the representative of my union, I am involved in many difficult pastoral and ecclesial situations. It is tempting to resign and become convinced that human brokenness is the only true dimension, after all. Also, visiting different countries, experiencing Christianity in its confessional and cultural diversity, make somewhat clear landmarks which define God's kingdom that operate in my church, turn out to be relative and not so obvious. On the other hand, these experiences enrich and strengthen faith. It is in these difficult moments for church leaders and communities that they break down and fight for God's values. Indeed, the diversity of experiences of grace by different churches, cultures, and nations reveals a certain coherent unity of understanding and action in the world of regenerated people. In spite of their weaknesses and struggle with sin, the work of grace is revealed just as strongly, or even more, seeing that it is a new quality that enters the reality of their existence in a shared understanding of the Word, God, sin, and obedience to God's will. But why do I share those reflections under the heading of God's sovereignty as an inevitable starting point? Because this principle of Kuiper makes sense to such perspective. Speaking on Calvinism on his third stone lectures, he said, "This dominating principle was not soteriologically justification by faith, but in the widest sense cosmologically, the sovereignty of the triune God over the whole cosmos in all its spheres and kingdoms, visible and invisible. God's sovereignty binds all spheres of life together. More specifically, this includes grace and sin. Releasing sin from God's sovereignty, and there are so many options right now, also in theology, but in practice, in piety, to do it, inevitably reduce the area of his sovereignty, along with growing awareness of the universality of sin, at least. Of course, assuming God's sovereignty behind all events also leads to many serious questions that are hard to find the right answer to. However, it gives a starting point that is able to comprehend all reality and allows just this. With intellectual honesty, I am able to see both grace and sin. I do not have to be naive by denying sin when I see it. I do not have to be cynical by denying grace and love when I see it. A sovereign God allows honesty in seeing both processes equally clearly. Secondly, struggles with science. Living in Eastern Europe between Russia and Western Europe provides a special point of reference for various cultural trends and influences. I do not intend in any way to aspire to neutrality, God forbid. Nevertheless, I would like to note the distinctive character of my culture, resulting both from the collective memory of liberation from communism, longing, largely defeated for joining the West, disappointment with its politics, and the feeling of constant and justified danger on the part of the East, which is misunderstood in the West. In other words, a kind of cultural uniqueness of being in between East and West, and somehow of both sides, precisely as a pole. This being in between is further strengthened by being the minority in an overwhelmingly Catholic country, being part of Polish evangelicalism in general and Baptist community in particular, having its own identity and history, but also constituting very little Polish group, which is estimated at the most 50,000 people. This experience leads me to some reflections about contemporary function of science, both in modern West and on the Soviet East few decades ago. Unfortunately, there is no major difference between them. When I was working on my doctorate, perhaps the most revealing and new ideas were related to the definition of science I got to know in the Encyclopedia of Sacred Theology. Kuiper speaks there of science as an effort to reflect the world in the collective consciousness of mankind, or if you like, his own precise definition, a necessary and ever-continued impulse in the human mind to reflect within itself the cosmos, to think it through logically as to its relations, always with the understanding that the human mind is capable of this by reason of its organic affinity to its object. I like this definition very much, and I completely agree with it, at least as far as I understand it. First, because of its time span, science is the reflection through the generations. By pointing to this aspect, Kuiper teaches us humility towards previous researchers. He teaches us also humility toward future researchers by pointing us forward. This should be remembered by so many scientists who dogmatize their modern conclusions. Speaking about collective consciousness, Kuiper shows that science is an effort of humankind, the greatest enemy of which are various fashions and politicking, to whom servitude to short-term local goals is a betrayal. He shows also that the fragmentation of science, the operation of its individual areas in incoherence, without looking for an organic mutual connection, is, at least from the Christian perspective, a sin of omission. Speaking of reflection in human mind, the cosmos, Kuiper indicates the necessity of intuition in science, a thread today neglected, if not carefully hidden, in the name of false pretense of the objectivity of scientific effort. This definition also shows how important are the concepts with which we describe reality as an integral part of science, as they merge with research into the ultimate effect, which is reflection of world in our conscience. They present themselves as not neutral at all. They always derive from older concepts and the worldview that created them and that uses them. This also shows how important is the organic unity of the scientific community, that science has to be interrelated and aim to be a unified body of but one knowledge, of but one humankind, even as it is a goal that we know never will be achieved. Looking at the methodological chaos and mutual exclusion of the adopted methods and assumptions in modern sciences, one longs for a science as described by Kuiper. Finally, this definition, with its stressing of importance of mind and concepts, ultimately leads to the conclusion that, at least at some stage, as Christians and non-Christians, we have different perspectives, and this is inevitable. Therefore, the regeneration of Christian consciousness must influence scientific formulations. Thus, there is no such thing as the neutral science, since science is inevitably an amalgamation of intuition and facts, imagination and reality, concepts and matter, language and the world. This is why subjective part is necessary, and therefore, at least in some part, Christian distinctiveness is necessary too. In other words, this definition of science violates the modern founding myth of worldview neutrality, which is the one that can build on the one world on the basis of science alone. It is fiction and a lie. I know it could sound radical, but I have deep conviction that we have to sound radical or we won't change anything. And I think change is necessary. Firm belief in objective science is its own biggest problem. It drowns out research that is politically incorrect, compels scientists to remain silent in the face of facts and data, limits the freedom of research, it destroys progress and makes science a disgusting tool of populism, often at the service of totalitarianism. And it will inevitably be until we agree with Abraham Kuyper that there is no objective teaching, that our concepts and our sinfulness influence scientific research. Therefore, we have to agree on freedom of scientific research in its own sphere. Science without the Kuiperian reform will sooner or later prove to be a criminal justification for modern forms of eugenics, as it was before the Second World War. Believing in objective human science is believing again, at least from my perspective, in Übermensch, who does not need God. The renewal for distinctively Christian science is necessary not primarily for some dogmatic purity, but rather for courage, sincerity, and humility in scientific research. This is missing not only in the world, but also, at least in part, among Christians who do not having their own theology nor ethos of scientific research, often blindly and shamelessly imitate the world. The pretense of neutrality by Christian scientists, which is in fact, sometimes at least, hypocritical, pretending to be someone you are not, is the problem of evangelical science. We should, with all due respect to the universal achievements of non-Christian science, with honest interaction with it, assuming our own limitations and bias, build our own corpus of knowing and understanding the world, reflect the world in our regenerated consciousness, and as it is our task, especially in the field of social sciences. Thirdly, struggles with antithesis and common grace. In my practice of being a denominational leader, often I ask myself questions about importance of my own identity, both as Christian in relation to other religions and as Baptist in relation to other Christians. These questions intensified during the annual week of prayer for Christian unity each January. As part of this season, the Catholic Church also celebrated a day of Judaism and a day of Islam, in which it usually organized interreligious prayers. As a member of the Polish Ecumenical Council, I was invited to both events. Further, I was obliged to conduct one of these meetings in a Baptist church. I mean, the ecumenical ones, not Judaism or Jewish day. The situation was made much more difficult and delicate by the fact that the majority of Polish Baptists were converts from the Catholic Church, often with difficult experiences. As I contemplated our participation in these events, I pondered the relationship between antithesis and common grace, especially remembering the comment of D.A. Carson that once Kuiper achieved political power, his thinking underwent a subtle shift in emphasis. Eventually, the antithesis between belief and unbelief, between redeeming grace and common grace, waned. In a way, the history of anti-revolutionary party, its loss of identity, proves indeed that too much focus on common grace makes the antithesis, and indeed Christianity as such, irrelevant. The basic question here is whether the relationship between redemption and creation, antithesis and common grace, is in fact a zero-sum game. In other words, can you enlarge one without reducing the other? Of course, I know there are many answers to this, and I really have been to some very interesting presentations about it, but let me give my own opinion here. So far, my observations proves you cannot, in spite of the inclinations of my heart. Every time a Christian establishes common ground with unchristian, somehow diminish the exclusiveness and uniqueness of Christianity, which, by the way, in itself would be no harm were it not connected with exclusiveness and uniqueness of Christ himself. Of course, we can try, as Kuiper did, to baptize common grace by referring to Christ, the Creator, as the source of common grace and to the glory of God as the end goal of both God's works, redemption, and creation. This is, by the way, certainly true. I believe in it. However, questions about our practice and engagement remains. Specifically, is it proper for Christian to do something good without experiencing a commitment to redemptive grace? In other words, without this deep persuasion in heart that it's due to redemptive grace that operates in my heart? Or is the reference to common grace enough? And if so, why do I need redemptive grace at all? The uniqueness of Christ, after all, is to be identified only with the realm of redemption. In the work of creation, I can persuade myself I serve Christ. But if this experience of one's existence and engagement is in no way linked to the work of redemption, it's completely overlapping with other people's experience, regardless of regeneration, ultimately leads to secularization. Redemption melts into creation, and Christ in the work of creation remains a silent master, requiring no honor and offering no help. He's accepting humanity without conversion, the Holy Spirit, the Bible, and the hope of eternal life. So if it is good for him, why should I be holier than himself? It seems to be an unreasonable zeal and hypocritical bigotry. So agreeing with Kuiper that it is a misconception to leave non-church realities outside of Christ's realm, I must confess I find the solution of common grace not adequate to the problem. Although I still use these two terms, I am less and less convinced to do so. Keeping the balance between them is difficult, especially being more and more persuaded of their internal conflict. Probably the relation between what is common for humankind and what is distinctive for Christianity should be grasped differently. Is a Christian's love for a fallen world a universal or particular grace? What is the difference between two Poles accepting refugees from Ukraine? A non-Christian and a Christian. Are they motivated by the same mercy or two different kinds? Are we too insensitive to the grace of redemption by assigning all people the same motivations? Or maybe too idealistic, ascribing higher motivations to Christians? Here it catches my attention that Orthodoxy speaks of only one transformation, seeing its source in the Christ's incarnation and resurrection. Hence the concept of apokatastasis, which is eschatological, all-encompassing change. And hence the assignment of all human goodness into redemption, what I like very much, which acts as the principle of the cosmic renewal of the universe. And again, it is not complete vision. The significance of Christ's death is diminished in it, although the greatness of the incarnation and resurrection, which are somehow diminished in the Protestant perspectives, are strongly emphasized. Apokatastasis also has problem with hell, which in Reformed perspective is also the triumph of God's glory through exaltation of the God's justice. Perhaps we are still waiting for a model that would combine these two dimensions, what is common and what is unique. Perhaps we are too impatient to expect theology to deal with this question in merely 2,000 years. Or maybe God will instruct someone in this room to finally put it in the way it should be. Fourthly, being honest to my own Christian tradition based upon a Christian vision of the history. Abraham Kuyper knew who he was, and knowing who he was, he knew who he was not, knowing who the others were. The theology of history, in which he saw particular grace and common grace as creative forces, we've seen as the counterforce, incarnating and mingling in the life of nations, civilizations, continents, churches, traditions, and individuals, with a passion for classifying and defining various confessions and schools of thought, contrasts with contemporary gibberish, in which propaganda, self-presentation, market capacity of slogans and formulas becomes the main motivation for such and not other opinions presented. At the same time, one's own identity, elusive light and not connected with history, contributes to intellectual dullness. Treating the Bible seriously as God's word, unfortunately, does not go hand in hand with the biblical vision of history, full of God action, valuable, worth knowing, and above all, filled with organically growing communities and generations that God regenerated. Fifthly, the need for Christians to impact the world. I started this lecture with Abraham Kuyper's principle that faith is to incarnate itself into all spheres of life. Let me also close my lecture with this principle in the imperative. Christians are here on this earth to impact the world. I know I am most probably preaching to the choir, but still this is something I learned from Abraham Kuyper, and it is so profound I cannot omit this. Purely theoretical views that create nothing cannot be true in a biblical sense. God's truth is always creative. It always serves the good, the development of the kingdom, and motivates to praise and gratitude. It changes and shapes people. Looking at contemporary evangelicalism, I see a weakness, if not crisis, here. The hesitation in changing the world, the taint of doubt and withdrawal are present in contemporary evangelicalism. You can search for reasons in different places. I think it results from the extreme individualization of faith. We see faith only in relations to individual, rarely in relations to community, family being maybe the only exception, and church. But no city, no other communities at all. No nations even. It also results from the tacit consent to divide the reality into the private and public spheres, with first being godly and the second sinful. With all my questions about common grace, I cannot see the message of Scripture differently, but teaching us about the fundamental unity of all reality and all its spheres of human life, being in the need of redemptive power, that is, subjecting them to Christ, who is calling them mine. Of course, it is not only Abraham Kuyper's legacy, but also the Reformed tradition as such. And to recover from the abandonment or resignation in this area seems to me the most important task ahead contemporary evangelicalism. Christianity, which does not change, becomes its caricature, an empty shell. True, everything must begin with a regenerated, believing heart, not from sacraments nor external forms, at least from my Baptist perspective, however helpful they may be in the process of sanctification. Even if we believe with Kuiper in presumptive regeneration, we must finally wait for the heart to beat for God consciously, so that we can honestly name and recognize this reality of grace. But faith is to find its proper embodiment. Let me show the example of its importance on my church in Warsaw, a small Baptist congregation that until recently met mainly on Sundays. The decision a few weeks ago, 3 days after Russia started aggression against Ukraine, to open up our campus for refugees changed our life completely. Responsibility for helping, for testimony, for the lives of others, caring for them, the necessity to devote time and effort, my time and my effort, this changes every believer. Faith can be embodied in many ways. One thing is certain: practical obedience nullifies many empty theoretical discussions about the role of faith and the church. Action itself eliminates justifications of passivity and apathy. Further, the fruit of action closes the mouths of critics and opens the eyes of the world. Of course, such experiences do not solve important theoretical questions about the model of Christians' influence. However, without experiencing the impact on the world, without sacrifice and service, we stand still. Conclusion. Abraham Kuyper and mysterious operations of the providence of God in my life. So here are my lessons from Abraham Kuyper. I don't know if he would be happy that he became an important point of reference for me. I hope we will be able to discuss it one day. Either way, God used him as a figure that inspired me to follow Christ more. Because of Kuiper, I apply biblical principles better at the time God gives me. I seek to be faithful more to God's kingdom. I desire to learn how to incarnate the word incarnate in my own life, I would say with deepest reflection and boldly. But that's not all. As I mentioned in the introduction, I also see some similarity between Kuiper and myself in the way God guides us through life. Of course, many things in our story differ, and some are radically different. I am a Pole, born during communism, whose youth was shaped by the pursuit of freedom. I am a first-generation regenerated Christian who was born into a nominal Catholic family and later radically converted to Christ through the testimony of a tiny minority in Poland. And here you can admittedly find a similarity to a Kuyper's conversion in best, maybe. I am not as educated, nor as intelligent, nor as hardworking, nor as influential as he was. And yet, I respect education like he did. I come from a family which, with many different deficiencies, especially being agnostic, atheistic, instilled in me the will, ability, and courage to think. In the course of my Christianity, God also planted in me the will to change the world. God also led me to know and understand God's sovereignty as a revolutionary concept. And then he also gave me to meet the figure of this Dutchman on my way. Since then, consciously or not, I see God shaping my life in a similar way as he did with Kuiper. And actually that was something that I realized when I started to prepare for this paper. So I started to prepare basically about his concepts, and then I realized, actually I see more. So this is some added value for me, which I'm very thankful for you who welcomed me here. So I started law as an assistant pastor in a small Baptist congregation. I later became assistant teacher in our seminary, devoted myself mostly to study and reflection. Now I'm a vice president. Later I began to be editor-in-chief of our Polish Baptist monthly magazine, and I am still today. Eventually, as I mentioned, I was also chosen to be the president of my union and the chairman of Polish Evangelical Alliance. And quite recently, I was elected to be vice president of the European Baptist Federation. I am also in the process of founding a Christian university. Not in Europe, though, but in Tanzania. I started from scratch a few years ago with the founding of a seminary. And I remember the time, it was about 10 years ago or so. I was welcomed by my friend who is a pastor in Uganda. He ran orphanage, and when he said, I want those children to be educated. And then I realized how important it is to provide education in such places, because without education there is no change of life. Just perpetual circle of poverty. And then I remember this time when I asked myself, should I dream so big to start a university? And that's important. I'm not sure how you deal with your own dreams in your lives. I think it takes courage to dream big. And I remember during that time I said, somehow the example of Kuiper encouraged me on the way. Somehow it encouraged me. I felt like maybe I could try. Maybe I should try. Maybe I should not be discouraged and fail even to dream about it. So that was a very important moment in my life. The project is still in the beginning, but seeing the process from the desire that arose in my heart about 10 years ago to what it is today, I see God at work. And imitating Abraham Kuyper. Since the beginning of the pandemic, I also have started my own kind of newspaper. I post a Bible study on YouTube every morning. I have heard some discussion about how many followers people have. I don't have many followers, although I have 500. I don't know how good you are. I don't have so many, maybe 100 viewers every day. But again, if you start from zero, by the way, it's huge effort, because I have like 700, every day I record something. 700 days. So I'm pretty sure guys who have got so many work, they maybe with some different subject than my reflection on the word, they are somewhere else. But I'm really thankful. I'm really very happy that I have this platform. And there are people I meet in Poland. I still publish in Polish. Maybe I should publish in English. But I meet them. When I travel. They say thank you. Some say thank you. That was 2 months. I listened to it. Some said from time to time I listen it. But I really think it's a great benefit anyway. And it's still following Abraham Kuyper, since I think his newspaper was a similar kind of project in a way. So far, I don't see God leading me into politics. Maybe it's not time yet. Perhaps I am to imitate Kuiper in the rest of his life. I do not feel compelled in any way to follow him in everything. However, I do feel a connection, a bond, which makes me more courageous when faced with challenges and big dreams, and convince me that it is possible and worth trying to go for it. I wish all of us similar role models, perhaps even Abraham Kuyper, for you too, and for us to become role models like that for others. Thank you.
Good, so we do have time for some discussion and questions, so just raise your hand if you've got something you want to ask Mateusz, and I'll bring it over to you.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned this internal debate in your head about the common grace thing and the particular grace. Has it occurred to you to maybe look at how other people who were at Kuyper's time perhaps dissatisfied with this approach, how they have tried to deal with the same realities? Because there are people who, I would say even who are new Calvinists who don't really subscribe to this way of framing the same realities, and that might be useful to you as well.
Well, I would say I was a devoted Kuyperian for a long time. In a way, probably when you are in the local church, in some local ministry, surrounded with the same people all the time, somehow you, practically speaking, on pastoral level, this model works. But when you actually realize the diversity of people, the diversity of church expressions, the diversity of traditions, when you go through some intense moments of history with people who are not Christians, then you start to ask yourself about what is unique, and what is common, and what is redemptive, and what is creational. So I just, I don't offer any solution. I just think right now, and this is where I am at right now. I just would like to be sincere and open. That's all I can offer, nothing more. And I'm persuaded fully that we are to honor Christ. But we also have to be sincere and ask ourselves about what is common between us and Christians. And I see so many real mercy, real grace, real love in people around me. Maybe, as I mentioned, maybe I will never get to any conclusion. Maybe I don't need to. I just have to be Christian at the end of the day. But my point is, I don't see a solution that would satisfy me so far.
What I find most satisfying about what you've said is that it involves a personal journey where you end up in a different place where you began. And I think that is actually at the center of the spiritual life. If you believe, as I do, that Jesus is always ahead of us, there is nothing we can think about the quest that he represents that he has not already imagined. And therefore, it's in the nature of Christianity that there should be a journey in which your perceptions change over time. And one has to be patient with that and tolerate whatever your conclusions are, even if they should come out in a place which you'd rather not be. Nonetheless, that is what you now think is true. And I just think that that is a fundamental reality here that you really illustrated. And it's contrary to what I would take to be the orthodox or the conventional view of Calvinism, which is a set of doctrines that were established for all time at a certain time and which have to be absolutely obeyed. No, that's not the story you're telling at all. And I think that's really true to the spiritual life. And we should count ourselves fortunate if that's the experience we have. I don't mean that everybody has to have it, but if we have it, we should proceed without fear.
Thank you. I agree fully.
Thank you for the lecture, and thank you for the image of Abraham Kuyper as YouTube content creator. I will be dwelling on that for some time. I actually think he probably would be on YouTube, but that raises to me a lot more questions. So I'm just curious to pick your brain in terms of, there might, silly versions would be, would he also be like a TikTok creator? Which
This is my second thought.
Yes, I don't think he would go that far with dancing and whatnot, but I am curious, just how do you see, maybe beyond your own story or also within it, how do you see these kind of new forms of media from a Kuyperian point of view? He thought of his newspaper, his journalism, as a way of educating the public. And are there other people, whether in Poland or around the world, that you see doing a similar sort of ministry? And in your experience, 700 episodes is a lot. That's almost 2 years worth. What has been positive? What has been negative? What has worked? What hasn't? I'm just curious to know more about that.
I think this new dimension of our life, because this is new dimension of our life, virtual life, I think it's true, somehow. And when I mean it's true, I mean true love, true care, true grace could be expressed to people we know through those means. And in the same way, there are some people I like to watch on YouTube, and they became my role models too. They don't even know that I exist, but I like their personality. I like their way of expressing thoughts. They are not even pastors. They are thinkers. Like there is one man who is very serious geopolitical thinker in Poland, and I really like to, and I enjoy simply to listen to him. So I would say, I think it's true. I think we should agree that we can transfer that we can shape people through these new channels. And I think we should not be afraid of it. We should not be stupid, silly, but I think we should use it. I'm pretty sure. I also see even my son who is playing a lot, and I know one of brothers here also is focused. Maybe he's not here today, but I spoke with him yesterday, and he said there are true meaningful relationships established during playing the same games online. And it could sound strange for us, but there are 2 billion people who would agree with it. So, it's quite a big testimony. So I feel like it's real, and we should use it. And we should not be afraid. And actually, we should do a theology of it.
Thank you very much for your lecture on the imitation of Kuiper theme. As a fellow European, so much of what you said resonated very deeply with me. I'm from Scotland. Mm-hmm. Our churches are also numerically very small, and it's very often the case that we have people who are like the Scottish version of you, who wear so many hats and by necessity have to do so many things. And I understand fully why Kuiper would be an inspirational figure to you in that context, as he can be in Scotland as well. But one area of Kuiper's life that is not worthy of uncritical imitation, I think, is Kuiper on rest. So he did all of these things, but he also ran himself into the ground and had a couple of nervous breakdowns. Mm-hmm. Didn't go to church because his work and this, the nation needs me more than writing newspaper columns, more than it needs me sitting in a pew on a Sunday. So in that aspect of the imitation of Kuiper, or Kuiper as a role model in our similar contexts, what should we do with Kuiper on rest?
Actually, I think we had 2 presentations today about Kuiper on health issues. Let's make it more broadly. Certainly, I'm lazy enough to not follow Kuiper in this respect. So I'm naturally inclined not to follow him. So I don't have this problem. But theoretically speaking, of course, we have to have some conscience, some reservations in our mind. Anytime we follow anyone, even Paul, I usually assume when I'm reading his letters that God is giving me him as an example. And I feel that the bond with Paul somehow also. I don't know how you feel about Paul. I feel the bond. I really feel like I understand this man in his zeal, in his desires, in his serving the Lord. But of course, we could discuss whether everything that Paul has done, actually, he's a positive role model for us. And maybe he was speaking too harshly on Galatians to, not only circumcise themselves. I mean, there are some places where we have to have some reservations even to the best role models. And as I look at Paul in the Bible, I think it's the same. He was sure he's not as Christ, but still he was responsible enough and wise enough and maybe brave enough to still show himself as the example to others. Because at the end of the day, he was good enough for them to grow. And I think that's always what is required.
Yeah, so a lot of us respect Kuiper for being a thinker and a doer. Mm-hmm. And you were speaking of what that engagement, that doing, does to sort of empty theory. And you gave the example of your church receiving all these Ukrainian refugees. And I think there's a quote from Calvin too, that in Geneva, when it was overflowing with refugees, telling people to build another floor in their house and stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if you could explore that more. Like, we're all thinkers here, mm-hmm. but that experience of doing and doing in the midst of this world crisis, that has us all sort of fascinated. What is that meaning for you, for your church?
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, that was the decision that basically after the service, after the first Sunday, I think the war started in Friday probably, I think it was. We just had to do something. We felt like we are prompted to do something, and we cannot simply go home. So we sat in the chapel and we started to talk what we can do. And since our church meets on the campus of our seminary, we decided that we will take responsibility for running the shelter because we had no extra people to do it. So we decided as the local church, we will do it. And I would say that was very chaotic at the beginning. Right now, we have 2 guys or 3 that we pay, but we still have some volunteers, of course, who help. Right now, we have many churches who came to Poland from various places of the world, also from USA, but also from Japan, also from Portugal, from many places, people who just wanted to help. And also sometimes it just happens that some trucks or cars appeared on our campus and someone said, here are the gifts from Germany, here are the gifts from Switzerland. It's so encouraging. It's so encouraging. Somehow people without much, plan. I'm a Polish man. I don't know whether you have this saying, let's do things in a Polish way. We in Poland say that doing something in Polish way is just doing, and we will figure it out how it works on the way. But in a way, sometimes when war starts, this is the way to do things. I mean, you cannot do much more. And basically, then you realize God provides people, provides some funds, provides help, and somehow you are able to run it. And what is most important and what is most encouraging in all of it, you see the presence of the Lord in all of it. Because you see people who are just spontaneously giving. They just want to help. They just, it's just great. Just a great moment or great moments. And of course, in due time, right now, it's more like a thing to do, obligation. And still we observe so many great things when those refugees are thankful, when those refugees are coming to our worship service. We have, on our service, we have about 60 people usually. But right now, with those people in shelter, we have 120 to 50 every day. When the Sunday comes, they just appear. So we have 120 Ukrainians every Sunday added. So for a church of 60 people, it's a big joy. It's a big joy. We have to translate everything to Ukrainian, but that's a big joy. That's that's a blessing. So yes, this is. I would say that's a blessing, basically, as really responding in one word.
Good, that's our time. Join me in thanking Mateusz for that.
Thank you.